Tonight, federal intervention.
Americans can rest assured that our banking system is safe. Your deposits are safe.
After the second biggest bank failure in U.S. history, regulators throw two failed banks a lifeline, plus a Middle East bombshell.
The new and deeply concerning factor here is the Chinese role in all of this.
The Beijing-brokered deal to normalize relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And
I wanted to die before them so they could bury me, but both of them died before me.
The hunger crisis in Africa. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Controlling the contagion after failed banks threaten the financial industry. Good evening in Washington, I'm Jenna Browder. Tonight, reassurances from the White House after a weekend of chaos in the financial industry. That chaos triggered by the second biggest bank failure in U.S. history. The Biden administration tonight insisting the American banking system is safe. CBN News White House correspondent Abigail Robertson has our top story from the White House. Abigail?
Jenna, President Biden announced this morning that people who deposited money into Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank of New York will have access to their funds today and assured them that their full deposits are protected.
Americans can rest assured that our banking system is safe. Your deposits are safe.
The turmoil began Wednesday when Silicon Valley Bank, a major lender in the risky tech industry, tried to sell assets to boost its balance sheet after losing money in bond investments when the Fed raised interest rates. That panicked investors as customers raced to withdraw funds after seeing the news on social media. The Fed stepped in, tying up $150 billion in deposits and putting some banks and tech companies at risk.
We must get the full accounting of what happened and why those responsible can be held accountable. In my administration, no one is above the law.
2 days after shutting down SVB, regulators then seized New York-based Signature Bank, which invested heavily in cryptocurrencies. While depositors at the banks will be protected, stock and bond holders will not be.
Investors in the banks will not be protected. They knowingly took a risk, and when the risk didn't pay off, investors lose their money. That's how capitalism works.
Biden says the extraordinary lifeline to the two failed banks' customers is not a bailout because the funds will come from an FDIC account, a pool of money paid into by U.S. banks.
No losses will be borne by the taxpayers. Instead, the money will come from the fees that banks pay into the Deposit Insurance Fund.
Analysts say for now a crisis has been averted and it's unlikely we'll see another major bank failure. But economists still think that we could be heading into a recession in the months to come. Jenna?
All right, at the White House, CBN White House correspondent Abigail Robertson, thank you. And here with us now is Greg McBride, Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Analyst with Bankrate. Greg, good to have you with us this evening. So first SVB, then the much smaller Signature Bank fails. You know, a lot of people don't have their money in these banks, but do you think we'll see more contagion in the banking industry at large?
No, I think contagion was averted. That was the significance of the step that the Federal Reserve, FDIC, and Treasury took last night when they stepped up and said that depositors, whether you're at a bank or a credit union, your money's safe, your money's accessible, whether you're under the federal deposit insurance limit or above the federal deposit insurance limit, your money is safe and accessible. And what that does is that prevents what could have been massive bank runs. All of a sudden, depositors don't need to move their money out of safety concerns because the money's protected. But I do want to be clear. We might see more bank failures because the idea isn't to keep banks that made poor risk decisions in business. It's to prevent good banks from getting swamped unnecessarily with withdrawal requests out of a panic. That's where that would have been a real problem, and that's what this program is designed to avert. But banks that made bad decisions, sure, they could still be subject to failure, as they would in any other environment. But as depositors, whether you're under or over the deposit insurance limit, your money is safe.
Greg, tell us about the fail-safes that were put in place after the 2008 financial crisis. How did legislation like the bipartisan Dodd-Frank Act help?
Well, it did shore up capital requirements. That's why a lot of the larger banks are much better capitalized at this point than they've been in years. And so, it's really a night and day difference among the larger banks. And, we're talking about banks that, even though Silicon Valley was the 16th biggest bank, they're still very, very small relative to the largest 4 or 5 banks. So, capital is much, much stronger. And then there's also this idea that uninsured deposits can be protected by deposit insurance, and the bill is going to go to banks. Banks have to pay into that insurance fund. And so that was something that's been on the books, since the passage of Dodd-Frank. That allows that exemption to systemically important banks. Basically, that's where they were able to come in and say, in the case of Signature in Silicon Valley, that uninsured deposits would be protected, even though they hadn't previously been designated as systemically important financial institutions.
So, Greg, how do you think these bank failures will play into the Fed's decision to continue raising interest rates?
That's a great question, and it's not one that we really know the answer to at this point. I think a lot of this really is just going to revolve around the stability of the financial system. If, over the course of the next several days, if the dust settles and financial system stabilizes and we're back to worrying about inflation or a really hot labor market, then the Fed may have a rate hike on the table later this month or at their next meeting in May. But if they're still swatting hockey pucks away trying to stabilize the financial system, then no, interest rates, further interest rate hikes are certainly going to be on hold for some time.
All right, Greg McBride with Bankrate, thank you so much. It's great to see you this evening.
Thank you, Jenna. Appreciate it.
Well, to election 2024, it's off to the races in Iowa. Former President Trump set to stump in the Hawkeye State, where the Republican Party is kicking off the presidential primaries in the race for the White House. Trump's speech focusing on education follows a number of high-profile visits by likely GOP presidential contenders. Hot off the trail, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis expected to announce his presidential bid this spring, and Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina. With a spotlight on Iowa, former Vice President Pence made headlines in Washington over the weekend. While not an official candidate for the White House, Pence sounded ready to take on his former boss at the annual Gridiron Club dinner. Speaking out about January 6th and the riot at the Capitol, Pence called out President Trump by name, saying, quote, "President Trump was wrong. I had no right to overturn the election, and his reckless words endangered my family and everyone at the Capitol that day. And I know history will hold Donald Trump accountable." All right, with that, we bring in Nathan Gonzalez, editor and publisher of Inside Elections and a Faith Nation contributor. Nathan, welcome. So this is really the first time we've seen Pence go there, pointing the finger at Donald Trump. Really, all of these candidates are treading lightly around the former president. Is that changing?
Well, that's what makes it news. That's what makes his comment newsy, is because it was more explicit than he's been before. He did choose a friendly audience, right? The media, which tends to overall tend to be more critical of former President Trump, was probably receptive to that message. If Pence had delivered that message to CPAC or another audience, he probably would have been booed off the stage. It's still unclear to me what is Pence's lane in what I would call a likely 2024 presidential run. He's trying to kind of be this critic of some things that President Trump did, but yet he was President Trump's vice president for 4 years. So there are some people that may want to move on from Trump, but he is so closely aligned because of his service, his time of service with him, that I still think he's caught in a hard place.
All eyes on Iowa right now, Nathan. How important are the Iowa caucuses these days?
Well, they're important because it helps a candidate get attention. If you are a politician and you show up in Iowa, you're going to get media coverage. And right now, this is a race to relevance in terms of getting attention. They don't have a great predictive value, Jenna. I'm sure you probably don't remember President Rick Santorum or President Mike Huckabee, some past winners of the Iowa caucuses. It is not just because you win it doesn't mean that you are guaranteed to go on to win the nomination. So it's important because it's one of those first states, but it's not. If a candidate loses Iowa, it doesn't mean they can't win the nomination.
Yeah, I think Ted Cruz won in 2016, and we all saw how that went. Nathan, Democrats are ditching Iowa and actually making South Carolina their first state for these primaries. How significant is that?
Well, it's significant. I mean, logistically, or the Iowa caucuses for Democrats were a disaster in how it was rolled out last time around. But also, there was just the increasing feeling that demographically, Iowa does not match the Democratic Party. There are not enough voters of color, minority voters there that would be representative or that should be representative in one of the first states that would choose a Democratic nominee. And that was part of the shift towards South Carolina. I would almost say the same thing, though, that I said for Iowa. Just because a candidate wins South Carolina doesn't mean that they're guaranteed to win. But it's significant because Iowa and New Hampshire have been the first two states for so long that anything different we're going to have to see how it plays out.
Yeah. President Biden, I believe, won South Carolina in 2020.
That's what saved him, Jenna. Yeah, that was what, without South Carolina and Congressman Clyburn, he probably wouldn't have won the nomination.
Yeah, that's what turned the tide for him. Speaking of President Biden, he seems to be trying to appeal more to the right, Nathan, as 2024 gets closer. He just gave the okay to a massive oil project up in Alaska, despite climate concerns voiced by environmentalists. What do you make of that move?
Well, the best thing that President Biden can do for his reelection effort is to do a good job. And if voters think he's doing a good job, and if they think the country is headed in the right direction, then he improves his chances of reelection. In terms of him being able to appeal to voters on the right, that's going to be difficult for him, meaning he might go far on one policy or do what they want on one policy, but conservatives or most Republicans are going to find 5, 6, 7 other things that they think Biden is doing a terrible job on, and they're not going to vote for him. So I think Biden should probably focus on making sure Democrats turn out, making sure independents trust him and believe he is the right person for another 4 years, and that's the recipe to winning another term.
All right, Nathan Gonzalez of Inside Elections. Thank you, Nathan.
Thanks, Jenna.
Have a great night. Well, a bombshell deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Coming up, the shockwaves rippling through the Middle East and the growing concern over Israel's security. Welcome back. Tonight, as Russia's war in Ukraine wages heavy losses in the battle for the tough-fought city of Bakhmut. Russian forces have captured the eastern part of Bakhmut, Russia's main target in a winter push that has overwhelmed Ukrainian fighters in recent days. Russia is sending hundreds of thousands of reservists and mercenaries in an all-out bid that has so far failed to encircle the city, escalating the fighting in a push to break through Ukrainian lines. In the Middle East, a bombshell deal making waves. China's role in brokering an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, fueling fears that America's influence is declining while China's is on the rise. And it's raising concerns about Israel's security and the future of the Abraham Accords. A CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem.
After more than a year of meetings and 4 days of negotiations in Beijing between Iran and Saudi Arabia, China said the three nations reached an agreement. The deal includes resumption of diplomatic relations, reopening their embassies within 2 months, and a commitment to respect each other's sovereignty, keeping out of their internal affairs. Many Middle East observers are concerned over China's role in brokering the deal.
The new and deeply concerning factor here is the Chinese role in all of this. To suddenly find, kind of as a surprise, that our new great power competitor, the primary threat to the American-led world order, China, was so central to this deal that involves not only our worst enemy in the Middle East, but bringing them together with one of our oldest Arab friends and allies and partners in the region, Saudi Arabia, is a new and worrisome development about China's own penetration and influence in this critical part of the world.
Jason Greenblatt, one of the architects of the Abraham Accords, says it reveals China's growing influence and America's waning power in the region. Should be a wake-up call to the Biden administration.
The United States essentially has ceded some important ground, an important area for U.S. stability and security, to China to some degree. That's not good for the United States. I think the United States ought to pay attention. I don't know if the Biden administration was caught flat-footed. It's hard to tell, but they ought to pay much closer attention now and work with the region, in particular Saudi Arabia, to be a part of it and not pivot away from it.
Hanna recently visited Saudi Arabia and met with its top leaders. He says Saudi is hedging its bets because its relationship with the U.S. is not as strong as it once was.
If the Saudis had their druthers, the relationship with the United States would be strong, secure. They'd have enormous trust and confidence in it. Unfortunately, that has all eroded drastically over the last 2 years. That was the message we heard when we were in Riyadh.
CBN News asked Greenblatt what this means for Israel.
But I think Israel needs to take a very, very close watch at this. Them too. I don't know if they were caught flat-footed here, but I think that rather than blaming within Israel whose fault this is, I think they need to look forward and figure out how do they protect Israel and how do they further integrate Israel into the security architecture of the Middle East.
Despite this deal, Greenblatt remains bullish on the Abraham Accords and believes it's still possible Saudi Arabia could join.
I am still very optimistic. As I mentioned, I travel there a lot, and with each passing trip, I'm just sort of amazed at what's happening on the ground in particular in Saudi Arabia. So I'm very, very optimistic. And I think we can look to the UAE to understand a country that has recognized a way to be close with Israel, develop strong ties with Israel, do significant business, and have security cooperation with Israel, while at the same time being realistic and understanding that Iran is also part of the region, and they can have ties with Iran while at the same time as having ties with Israel.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Hunger in the Horn of Africa. When we come back, the shocking death rate and what's being done to fight famine. The worst famine in more than 40 years is ravaging the Horn of Africa. A perfect storm of back-to-back droughts, COVID-19, and fallout from the Ukraine war have combined to create dire conditions. George Thomas reports from Kenya.
Fatuma Abdi Aluhu has just buried her 2 sons here on the outskirts of Mogadishu, Somalia. She lays a thorny branch on their graves to protect the bodies from wild animals. Both died from starvation.
I wanted to die before them so they could bury me, but both of them died before me.
Somalia and its neighbors in the Horn of Africa, including Ethiopia and Kenya, are facing unprecedented drought conditions.
We've had 4 failed rains. The drought that we're currently seeing in the Horn of Africa is the worst drought in over 40 years.
On average, 1 person dies every 48 seconds from hunger in the Horn of Africa.
Because of the drought, many water sources have dried up. Many wells have also dried up.
With crops failing, the United Nations says some 22 million people are at risk of starvation. Many of them farmers who only grow enough food to feed their own families.
People will be forced to flee to look for food. People will have to try and find a way to survive. And obviously this entails very perilous journeys for people who are already marginalized.
Many in the region who rely on livestock for livelihood have seen massive numbers of their animals wiped out.
For example, in northern Kenya, we've lost about 1.5 million heads of livestock. Similarly, in southern Ethiopia, we've lost over 2 million. In Somalia, we even stopped counting.
In Somalia alone, around 8 million people, or half the population, are experiencing crisis hunger levels. 1 in 3 children face chronic malnutrition.
I've been shocked to my core these past few days by the level of pain and suffering we see so many Somalis enduring. Famine is at the door.
Anne Kasambo oversees CBN's offices in Kenya. In partnership with Operation Blessing, they've been distributing food and other aid supplies to some of the hardest-hit regions of her country.
It's been quite devastating in some communities, and especially in the arid areas where even when there's rain, food is hard to come by because they're not able to grow their food.
4 consecutive droughts and African economies still reeling from the coronavirus pandemic have created these dire conditions.
As if that was not enough, the situation has been aggravated by the current conflict in Europe between Russia and Ukraine.
Before the war, Somalia imported 90% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine, while Ethiopia imported 42%. Kenya, which also imports oil, iron, steel, and fertilizers from Russia and Ukraine, imports 44% of its wheat from both countries. All that has come to a screeching halt since war started. The result? Skyrocketing prices for practically everything.
It has really affected us, especially on food prices. It has also affected the cost of fuel.
When the fuel prices go up, the production cost is higher, so everything is affected.
A new survey found most Kenyans are increasingly turning to their savings or taking out loans in order to meet the rising cost of living.
It's been a build-up from COVID to inflation, to drought, to the war in Ukraine. So just before one situation gets better, another one crops up.
In late August, the first ship carrying grain from Ukraine docked on the Horn of Africa, offloading some 2,300 tons of wheat.
That's enough wheat to feed 1.5 million people for about a month.
Food experts say that's a drop in the bucket, considering the immediate crisis facing millions across the Horn of Africa. George Thomas, CBN News, Nairobi, Kenya.
Finally tonight, humility on display at the 2023 Oscars. Artist and evangelist Charlie Mackesy, the one-time atheist turned believer, won an Oscar for his short film, The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse. The animated screenplay is based on Mackesy's popular book, telling the story of 4 creatures forming an unlikely bond. Mackesy accepted the award with humility and gratefulness, celebrating the efforts of his peers.
I think it takes a lot of courage to make a film. People that I've worked with, they've tolerated me for 2 years, and they're brave and kind. And thank you so much, and thank you to my mum and my family.
But Mackesy's humility goes much further than his acceptance speech. The world-class artist told CBN News that it was Jesus who introduced him to art, opening his eyes to the beauty in people. Now an unlikely evangelist, one of Mackesy's goals is to remind unbelievers they are seen and loved. All right, that does it for us.